What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Modern Craftsman. Today, it's just me, but I do have David Renggli from Switzerland on, and we are going to talk about really how the prefabrication, offsite construction, panelization. You guys know that I'm obsessed with this topic. Can really be utilized in all aspects of construction. Yes, even you guys that are doing smaller renovation projects, or you guys that are specific trades people. This is relevant for everyone. Ultimately, the topic of prefabrication and offsite construction is kind of the center of what we're talking about, but it's everything that leads to a successful endeavor in that space. The things that create success in that space, talking about pre-construction, talking about planning, talking about being more thoughtful, and talking about what exactly your role is when it comes to pre-construction. We also talk about how that specific topic, pre-construction, can be utilized in a scenario that you don't move forward with the project, and how that can be valuable to you in the industry as a whole. So, without further ado, let's get into it. But before we do, of course, this podcast is sponsored by Andersen Windows. Andersen is introducing their new 100 series flush fin window this spring. Product allows you easy installation into stucco applications without the hassle of disturbing the stucco, saving you time and money. With Andersen, contractors in the Southwest now have replacement solutions for any project. Their Fibrix material is the ultimate solution in Southwest climates, times stronger than vinyl, and with a finish 12 times thicker. Fibrix withstands 150-degree temperatures, even in dark colors. Those windows are not going to fade, flake, blister, or peel. And now, with the new flush fin product, upgrading old windows has never been easier. Every new product introduced by Andersen is being developed with the innovation, quality, and craftsmanship that has defined their brand for over 120 years. Learn more about the difference by visiting andersenwindows.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Buildertrend, balancing job site visits and office tasks, keeping track of the warehouse, sending purchase orders, and other countless day-to-day tasks. Too often, this is our reality as busy home builders. That's why managing job schedules is one of the most, if not the most, critical piece of any project. Buildertrend, the leading construction management platform for home builders, is here to help. After working with more than 1 million industry wide, they know scheduling is the secret to successful project execution. And to help get your next project started off right, Buildertrend created a schedule milestone template available at buildertrend.com/MC milestone. So to learn how to break down production timelines, then use the template to better outline your next job. Be sure to get your free copy at buildertrend.com/MC milestone.
Good to see you again.
Likewise, I think the last time I saw you, I was sitting waiting for an Uber.
Exactly. Almost not making it to the airport, as I recall.
What's going on with my camera? Why am I so blurry? No, we actually made it to
You
the
made
airport
it?
just fine. Why? Yeah, why is my camera so blurry? Let me see what's going on here. Maybe fix that. There we go. Yeah, it was funny. We hopped in the cab, and the gentleman was beside himself. He was like, "I'm so sorry." I'm like, "Hey man, it's okay. We got plenty of time. Like we're gonna be, we'll be totally fine on time." He goes, "There's one thing you got to know about Swiss is we're never late." And and I laughed, and I was like, "No, you guys have been amazing. And you being late actually didn't, impact my thoughts at all." But he was a gentleman at best, and got us to the airport, and I don't think we were in a rush at all.
All right.
So
Well, good to hear. Glad you made it.
yes. Um, so I don't even remember when was that tour? Was that last August?
I think so. It was, I wouldn't remember whether it was August or not, but it was certainly sometime middle third quarter of last year.
Yeah. Um, what an amazing trip, just all around. But your facility was I didn't get to see, I think, the last facility, but your facility was one of the most impressive. And you know, being there and understanding what you guys do and seeing the whole process, and not only how you're using technology, but how it connects to the people that are on the floor. And David, I think that's really what I want to talk about today. Um, because you know, what generation are you at this point?
Fifth generation already.
Fifth generation. And I'm gonna shut up for a minute and let you introduce yourself. But the point I'm bringing up is that you guys have evolved and grown and built this business, and you know, continue to support the people that are on, you know, on the floor working. And I remember, you know, how everyone was in a good mood, everyone was happy, everyone felt as though that they were contributing to the end product, while also respecting the fact that you guys have made massive strides in improving innovation and technology and computers and CNCs and the stacker, the I think it was a material stacker. If I might have the term wrong, but that was the most impressive thing, is just that you guys have really found that good balance, and there's no shortage of people and there's no shortage of machines in your facility.
Well, thanks for the compliments. I'm glad we got to impress you a little bit at least. I mean, now that you've seen a lot, you've traveled, and so yeah, happy to hear that we did some things right in those years.
You certainly did. So, for those that don't know, last August I had been invited by the SIGA team to visit Switzerland with a group of, I think, 15 or so others, and we got to travel all around Switzerland, seeing some really impressive factories, such as David's, and as well as some construction projects in progress. And if you haven't seen those videos, we posted them on my NS Builders YouTube. But David, take us back, or take a minute to introduce who you are, and who Renggli is.
All right, I'm going to start with myself. My name is David Renggli, representative of the fifth generation of Rengglis, a family-owned business here in Switzerland in prefabricated timber construction. Currently deputy CEO of the company and about to take over this autumn at the same time as we're celebrating our 100-year anniversary. So a lot happening this year. It's phenomenal to be part of this story and actually be able to lead that firm together with my brothers into the next couple decades, I'd hope. Um, for the company, Renggli AG, Swiss-based, 100 years old, as I mentioned, and basically up until probably the early 1990s, it was a rather small sawmill, carpentry shop, and their main business at the time was very local, at best regional, where we would build single-family houses, an old barn here and there, a roof, and such things. As a generation of my parents took over, however, they looked at the opportunities, and for them it was quite clear that just being a small carpentry shop and a sawmill didn't really give them enough of a unique selling proposition anymore, that it was kind of outdated, the machinery was old and whatnot, so they really had to figure out a way for themselves. And what they've done at the time is they got inspired by some German prefabricated so-called Fertighaus companies. They would do single-family houses prefab using timber, and they decided early in the 90s that they need to invest in a big factory, rip out the sawmill, basically let go of the old ways and start using more modern methods of construction. So they've done that, first focusing on the single family house space. At the time, also, timber construction wasn't as popular. Like, Switzerland isn't the market that is super used to stick framing, for example. So
Hmm.
traditionally, at that time, you would build your single family house using brick and mortar or concrete. And people would obviously ask at that time, like, why would I use timber to build my home? It doesn't feel sturdy, it doesn't feel durable. Why? And what they have done at the time is they really set themselves apart by focusing on energy efficient buildings. That primarily meant at the time well insulated walls and airtight building envelope. So we could really bring those energy consumption levels down. And that was a different way of going about it. It was
And that thought process was in the early
Yeah,
'90s,
I
you
think
said?
like in 1995 they made the first investment into the new factory, the smaller part that you've also visited, where
Mhm,
nowadays is only the CNC cutting of the parts.
mhm.
So they started that. They were rather successful, even though it was a huge investment at the time. It was several times their annual turnover that went into that factory, and they really, really had to prove themselves. Also at the time, by the way, that interest rates were sky high and so on, and they just had to kind of live through all of that and prove that the concept would actually work. And
You were, I assume, pretty young when this was kind of turning into a prefabrication company, but I'm sure you've heard the stories or at least have talked about what 1995 looked like, spending several times their revenue into something probably the majority didn't believe in. Like, as you're saying, people are thinking concrete, brick, mortar. It's funny, we get a lot of people commenting on the way we build here in the US. It's like, why would you build it out of wood? Why wouldn't you use brick? Why are you stick framing it? And I have my thoughts on that too, but um, you know, what was that like for them? And what really encouraged them or gave them the tenacity to work to power through it?
I think if you boil it down, it was a just immense belief in the fact that doing things off-site must be the better and more efficient way to build anything,
Yeah.
essentially. And at the time, obviously, there wasn't that much proof of concept around. But that strong fundamental belief in this idea is what encouraged them to take that huge leap and invest in such a big way. And I mean, well, I wouldn't say against the odds, but at least against what everyone else was saying. I mean, to this day, sometimes when we have visitors such as yourselves from the area, they say, well, to be honest, back in the 90s when we heard what was going on there, we first of all thought everyone was crazy that was involved in it, and second of all, it was going to be a matter of months until bankruptcy. So
Yeah.
that was the starting point. But they proved with a great team. I mean, a rather small team at that time. They were, I think, in the early 90s, about 12, 14 people. When they did the first factory, grew to about 35, 40. And I mean, it was just this immense dedication to the cause and this belief and daily hard work of just making it possible. And I think they were rather successful. I mean, the factory at the time was aiming, I think, of a yearly output of around about 40 to 45 single family homes.
Wow.
So that was the first step, basically coming from a small carpentry shop. Um, Big step. However, it worked. I mean, they worked a lot. They fought for it every day, but they eventually got the projects to fill up their factory.
Now, when you in the were you guys focused on CLT at that point?
No, not at all. I believe. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm rather young, so I have only vague memories of the time. But I don't believe that CLT was really a thing back then. Um, I mean, when we think today and when we see how much CLT or mass timber elements are used, we need to switch back to those times. And I think it was also not that common. I think the industry wasn't as
Mhm.
large as it is today, and for a big part there was also this, like, I mean, to this day, this question whether it is the best or most sustainable way to use mass timber or like full CLT panels versus the stick framed option with a lot less materials in use. So at the time that was really not an issue. I mean, we would just do basically stick framed double side closed panels from day one,
Mhm.
but CLT just simply didn't play a role at the time.
How much CLT do you do at this point?
We would never touch a project that is purely CLT. for the
Sure.
reason that we do have the factory, we do have the people on the shop floor, and if I buy CLT for any project, I won't get any added value in my factory. I would buy a pre-cut panel from the supplier, have it delivered straight to the building site, and all I get to
Mhm.
do, or our team gets to do, is basically assemble it,
Right.
which is essentially not that interesting to us because any somewhat skilled carpenter team can do it. You don't need any investment in machinery, in processes whatsoever. You just need to order the right parts. However, to this day, or especially these days, we see a lot of, I mean, maybe a little sentence of where we are at now. I mean, we come from this single family space, we left it completely, and now we're doing these multi-story timber frame buildings, right? So we're going once it was allowed in 2006, we went 6 stories in residential in Switzerland. Meanwhile, we've done 8 and 9. I mean, the code event essentially allows us these days to go up to 100 meters or 300 foot. So it has changed drastically also what you're allowed to do in timber.
Mm.
Therefore, we're moving more into that space. And today, our bread and butter is larger residential projects with 50, 20, 120 units per project. And in those projects, we see more and more the use of CLT for floors.
Mhm.
It's a rather efficient way of doing floors, especially when we sometimes combine it with concrete. This is timber concrete composite that we either prefabricate in the factory or then do it on site. And for those types of details, it totally makes sense to use a CLT plate for the floors.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was one of the that's one of the things I found so interesting when I was walking some of these multi-family home buildings is that they'd have this beautiful CLT on the floor,
Mhm.
and then it would get filled with this essentially soundproofing material, which was almost like a dense pack rock. And a lot of utilities would sit there, and then they would cast a concrete deck on top of that. And for me as an American, it's like totally different. Like, in so many ways, it's like if we have a wood frame floor, it's getting, wood on top of that.
Mhm.
And CLT for us is like something that we constantly think about how can we use it and leave it exposed because it's so beautiful. And there's different obviously grades in terms of like what is exposed material and what's not. But to see it covered up in like, you know, 7 inches of additional material, it just seemed wild to me.
I
But it's different.
yeah, I do agree. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's the clients that decide how much wood is going to be
Sure.
exposed, right? What we see oftentimes also here in Europe is that once you do have the CLT floors, that you would
Mhm.
leave the basically the ceiling side exposed.
Right.
But for soundproofing reasons, primarily, we still would do the concrete slab, fill up the floor part, the top part of it, and then you
Mhm.
might still have a wooden floor that is shown off as an actual floor in the end, right? But we need those combinations of materials because in multifamily residential, the customers here have very high expectations regarding soundproofing. So clients here would never accept that you would hear your neighbors basically walking on the floor on top of you.
I mean, that's a great example of how I think here it's so different where there's standards in place, but all of the standards that we typically build and I see built in, especially the commercial side, where it's usually barely scraping by. It's like they're looking to figure out what material they can use to just hit the number that they need. And you read any review of a multifamily building, they'll talk about I can hear my neighbor. And I've been part of some of those projects in thinking about a high-rise project I did many years ago. It's light gauge metal framing and it's got drywall, maybe 2 layers of drywall on either side with some fiberglass bat insulation. The reality is that's not very it's not very soundproof.
Well, I mean,
Uh
I've been on sites and projects also in the US and Canada, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I think here there's two differences. I mean, on one hand, I think just simply regarding the codes, I think they are more strict.
Mhm.
So even if we just follow the code for those type of build to let buildings, I mean, we need to do at least the minimal standard, which is far beyond what you would consider normal in the
I know.
US. That's one thing. And then the second part is, I mean, as far as clients go, but essentially also the tenants, I mean, they simply are used to this rather high quality for
Mhm.
everything. I mean, it's not just the finishes and how things are looking, but things like soundproofing is super important here, and therefore we need to build to their standard, because otherwise you would just have a bunch
Yeah.
of vacancies in those projects.
Yeah. The thinking about, so your product back in 1995, you were essentially taking what you were building on site and then bringing it into a factory. And, in large part, and I think a lot of people who are listening, think about panelization and prefabrication in the US as something that's just not there yet. And I constantly hear it referred to as sledgehammer construction, meaning that they're getting panels on site and then all they have is a sledgehammer because they're just pounding that stuff together because it doesn't fit well. And I see some of the product that gets delivered to some of these sites, and I can understand why there's so much resistance against it, because the quality isn't there. And and it's built with maybe number two material,
Hmm.
maybe material that's just not, doesn't stay true. And seeing your operation and seeing someone like Benson Wood, who I think you
Yeah, I've
have,
visited. Yeah,
yeah, you visited them. They're dealing with just a higher quality material. So when these walls are being built, it's not, they're not slapping a wall panel together. They're building a panel to a very high tolerance, because ultimately they understand that it only can go together one way.
absolutely. And I
So
mean, I mean, to give you an example here, like instead of using like what is as I think referred to almost like green lumber that is sometimes used in
yeah,
stick framing,
yeah,
I mean, this would be a material you wouldn't find in our factory at all. Not just the green type, but we use
hmm,
for studs and beams inside the panels. We only use glue lamps,
hmm,
right? So why is that? Well, first of all, because it's easier for our machines to handle it, and the type of
hmm,
precision that we're looking for, to a tenth of a millimeter, basically, for every single cut. We only get there if we use material that is somehow form stable. We get that with the glue lamps. If we don't use glue lamp, then there is just too much torsion, there's shrinkage, et cetera, when we're exposed to different climate conditions. So we won't be able to deal with that if we go multi-story. That might be okay if you build a single family home,
hmm.
2 stories, where when you're a couple millimeters off, like no one really sees in the end. But if we go 8, if we go 6 or 10 stories, well, those millimeters add up to inches eventually if we're
Hmm.
unprecise, and it's simply not good enough.
Yeah, it's, being in the commercial side, I remember, we had a survey, specific high rise project. It was 28 stories, and the survey crew was on site every day, making sure that the building was going up straight. And I chatted with them, while we were on the project, and they're like, "Oh yeah, some of these build like, he pointed to a building. He goes, that one over there, that one actually, when it was all done, actually sunk 7 inches." And I was like, "What?"
Yeah,
And they're like, "Oh, that's nothing." He goes, "We had a project down in Miami, 18 inches it dropped." And
exactly.
I'm like, "How?"
And
I'm like,
imagine what we have to deal with now. So if we build multi-story, we also have to take into consideration that oftentimes the staircase, the elevator shafts are done in concrete. So we've got a
yeah.
different behavior in terms of shrinkage and sinking than what we would
Mhm,
see in the wooden panels. So we need to engineer from the get-go. We need to engineer that, for example, the compression that a panel would take over multiple stories is greater than a concrete wall. Now
yeah.
we still need to make sure those floors or the roof is essentially staying straight, right? Or the
Right.
outside edges are not shrinking more than the tower in the middle. So we need to calculate all of that, engineer all of that, and take it into consideration. And therefore, for the plan to work, we need to make sure to be extremely accurate when we produce those panels. And
Mhm.
honestly, I don't see. I mean, I see it's not that easy, but at the same time, I don't see how you can be that far off. I mean, we plan everything to the greatest perfection, 3D, digital, before we
Mhm.
start anything in the factory. So once
Mhm.
I've defined my measures, whether something is an inch or an inch and a half, well, why would I not be able to cut it to that exact length? And once I have the exact length and some technical support in place, some machinery in place, with that, on that we build our all our panels on flipping tables.
Mhm.
Also, the tables get the information of what type of element is being built on them as we speak. So therefore, we've got these big NC bolts kind of putting all the pieces into place so they fit snugly and perfectly. Another little trick that we do, since every single part that goes into a panel is cut on a CNC machine, every single every single board, every single stud and beam is going through the CNC. So we would use on some of the elements we would kind of cut little notches, of three
Mhm.
4 millimeters. You've seen them, so we would visually see exactly where the pieces need to come together, and only if you're in those little notches with your studs, for example, the whole element will fit together. So therefore,
Mhm.
there's those little tricks that help us reach this ultimate precision that we need for our projects.
Yeah, what David's saying, we actually I think we have that on video. Essentially, the top and bottom plate is what you're talking about, has essentially a notch for that stud to have a positive placement.
Exactly.
Um, and it's, I mean, I think the important thing here, and the thing I really wanna, really uncover, is the level of precision and why it's so important, and you're alluding to it now, but, you know, when you think about, or even your comment about, if we're going to do everything in 3D and do all of the planning and be super thorough with this, why wouldn't we be able to deliver something that's incredibly accurate? And this is, I think, especially in the US, is where residential construction, and I know we're talking about multifamily in your case, but in residential construction, we just don't take enough time to think things through. And it's been an argument that I've brought up multiple times where, you know, there's a panelization company near me that I had the opportunity to visit, and we've had them on the podcast, Cape Cod Panel, and they are panelizing, a pretty traditionally built wall, but in the shop, and their waste factor is almost nothing. The entire at the end of the job, they have a 55-gallon bucket worth of scrap. And the only way they were able to do that is by optimizing the length of material,
Exactly.
by saying, "Hey, I have a 21-foot stud, and I'm going to cut it up this way because I know that I need all of these pieces at some point in the job." No human being can do that. And I mean, physically, yes, they could sit there and figure out every single stud, but it would be enormously expensive,
Exactly.
and they're
So it's
and
imperative
not
that
worth it.
you use the proper nesting software, is what we call it. Goes for all the dimensional lumber, as well as the all the whether that is sheetrock, whether that is three-layer board or OSB or whatnot. I mean, it's the same story. Basically, buying
Mhm.
them in bulk, obviously. In a we do oftentimes in custom sizes that fit essentially to our building system or to typical sized panels. But
Mhm.
even there, like if we buy a truckload or even container load full of OSB plates, we would then put every single one of these boards onto the CNC cutter, even if it's for nothing else but cutting around. So we make sure it's exactly rectangular,
Mhm.
because they just don't come exactly rectangular out of the factory. And then, of course, we nest them and check always against the model and see that we get the maximum output out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, that's interesting. I missed that part, but you think about, you're getting this stuff from a factory that is, you don't know what their tolerances are compared to yours.
Well, I mean,
If you're
that's the thing. We do know exactly what their tolerances are because there is a
oh,
norm, right? But it's just not
right,
accurate enough for the
right.
type of product that we're producing here.
Were you got in the 90s, was there such a focus on being super accurate, or was it more about bringing, just starting by building this stuff in a factory?
I think the accuracy didn't play such a crucial role back then because we were talking or building single family houses, 2 stories, right?
Mhm,
And as I said before, over the 2 stories, even when you're you know tenth of an inch off somewhere over a couple feet, well, it's not going to
mhm,
be the end of the world, right? Your
sure,
customer won't notice. You essentially won't even notice yourself. Probably there's little
mhm,
fixes on site um, to kind of cover up those, let's say, mistakes or faults, because they
mhm,
essentially don't really have a negative impact on the whole building itself. As long as you got the airtightness covered, it's going to be okay quality wise. But
mhm,
as soon as we move into bigger projects, let's say we do 100 apartments, your building is 300-400 feet long, and X stories high. Well, it's gonna become an issue, right? If you don't get that accuracy. So for us, it was essentially also a shift over time. I mean, we got better at just doing the panels in the first place, but then as the projects got bigger, we were also forced to make sure we're more accurate. But just to be
what
clear here, right? I mean, we're not talking that we were inches off in the beginning. I mean, we're talking,
sure,
a tenth of an inch maybe. That was an acceptable tolerance back in the day, and nowadays
mhm.
we want a tenth of an inch over 6 stories,
Mhm.
but not in a single element.
What why the switch from single to multifamily? Just a financial reason?
No, not really. I mean, when we started off with panelization and prefab, there was essentially nothing else you were allowed to build using timber,
Mhm.
right? So there
Sure.
was no other market than that. But what happened was that once some Swiss companies, such as ourselves, started doing those prefab single-family houses in Switzerland, the basically more mature German competition started noticing. And at the time, there were already factories in Germany doing, 100 and 200 houses a year. So we were a small player with our 30 to 40 houses. And then the bigger players in Germany thought, okay, the Swiss market is rather lucrative. We're neighboring countries, so the transport distance within Germany might be longer than just driving over the border to Switzerland. There was some free trade happening already at the time, so it was rather easy for them to enter into our market. And at the end of the day, you're also speaking the same language. Plus, Switzerland has always been a bit of a high-priced island within Europe.
Mm,
So customers would be used to paying more for a certain product here in Switzerland than they would right across the border. So it was rather lucrative for a lot of German firms to come in, and I would say almost every single bigger player in Germany has at one time or another started an operation or an export business to Switzerland. So the competition got increasingly fierce on one hand, and on the other hand, we also had a huge decline in the numbers of single-family homes being built in Switzerland. Like to this
mm,
day, the market is about one third from what it used to be in the late 1990s. The reason
wow.
being that I mean we're a super small country, rather densely populated, and therefore the available space to build was essentially not there anymore, and the prices for properties for a parcel of land would just go up and up and up. Has They have been going up even more over the last 20-30 years. So
Mhm,
essentially it just became really really hard for, let's say, a young family, you're married, 2 kids, 35. Well, at that time, but certainly not today, you could be able to afford to buy your own house. So
mm,
that market declined, competition grew, and we were in the middle of all of it, had that factory, and thought, well, okay, where are we going to go from there? And then we
mhm,
decided, all right, let's go into something that our competition is maybe not able to do or not willing to do because they're so used, these German factories to this day, they do single family houses. They're incredibly efficient. They're doing an incredible job at producing that specific product, but they're essentially not flexible in their organization and in their factories to deliver multi-story, because it's different processes, it's different engineering, it's different details, it's different panel structures, different materials that you need to use within the panel, etc., etc. So that for us was at the time a niche where we thought, all right, we need to move in that space. But there was obviously no reference point because no one has
Yeah.
done it at the time. And also, as an investor or as a building owner, well, you'd come to us, talk about it, and then say, well, prove to me that you can do it. But there was just
Mhm.
simply, I mean, today we have all the references, right? We can touch and feel them, we can go visit them, you can talk to tenants, you can talk to owners, etc. It's a different story. But back in the day, when it was in the early 2000s, we needed to become our own, or found a department within the firm that is to this day acting as a general contractor, where we would take on all the risk basically and deliver a whole project out of one hand using timber. And then we started building our own references and proving that this is an absolutely ideal solution to go multifamily, for example.
Sure. And in thinking back to the single family, what was you know, the value proposition there? Like, how are you selling that to someone that wanted to build a single family?
Well, at the time, I mean, the big value proposition there was that we had a solution to have those well insulated walls. I mean, we were able to
Mhm.
insulate basically between the studs, right? So we would generate more livable space at the end of the day. Plus, we would also build with more healthy materials and really focus on this energy efficiency that simply at the time wasn't addressed by the traditional methods of construction. So that was kind of where we were coming from. Plus, also, like as the German competition grew more fierce here in Switzerland, we started moving up in the segment. Like in the beginning, we would basically build houses for everyone, and then we
Mm.
started moving towards more expensive projects, towards customers who had an increased or wanted an increased level of quality, etc., etc. Because you need to understand here in Switzerland, and I think that's fundamentally different to the US. Typically here, if you can afford it and if you get to build your own house, you basically build it for generations. People
Yeah.
typically build once, and it's really uncommon that you would, buy your own house and then move to the next bigger one and move to the next bigger one. I mean, the Swiss people are rather like stable once they're in a certain place. They're not as flexible to move to the next city, or even when you do a career move, you wouldn't your first thought wouldn't be, hey, I need a bigger house or a bigger pool or more garages. That's just different to what I experienced in the US, where basically with every change in life situation, whether that's your career or your family is growing or whatnot, you just kind of move up, and typically you only stay in your home for a couple of years before you move on to the next one. Now,
Yeah, it's super interesting, and that was something that, just generally speaking, when I was in Switzerland, is just the speed and, like, of life and, like, how important, everyone's individual needs in life was. Where it's like you talk about living in a home for generations. That's who we target when we build. Like, we're looking to build with people that are building their forever home, that this is going to be a generational home, and we're just not a good fit for the consumption.
mhm,
Like, when someone is building a house for a short period of time, we just it doesn't make financial sense a lot of time, because we're building at too high of a quality. And the frustrating thing there is that that's the issue, is that we're building too high of a
mhm,
quality, where it's like, and I've had clients, I met with a client that wanted to build this really big, beautiful home, and we priced it, and we were way more than he wanted to be from a price perspective. And he said to me, he goes, "You would build an absolute beautiful home. It would probably be perfect. It would be a work of art. I just don't give a shit about it. I just want to build a bigger house for less money, and I don't care about the quality. And it was at that moment that I realized that that's the norm. And there's a big issue. I think that's what is has impacted our labor force. I think that our labor force is forced to do things for less money, for less, and then and in in response to that, they're doing it for less quality, and it just doesn't. It's not really helping anyone for for the for the long term in our industry. And that panelizing them or prefabrication and offsite construction, that's not the answer to it, but I do think that it is going to help, because the more we do it, the better we're going to become at it, and the more we're going to have the same realizations as you guys did, David, is that if we're already modeling this in 3D, why couldn't we make sure it's built within a millimeter? Why couldn't we pre-wire the wall? Why couldn't we locate all of the wall sconces on the outside of the home and air seal them before it leaves the factory?
You know, I mean, I totally agree, and I think my 2 cents on this is maybe twofold. Like on one hand, I see the target audience or the customer segment, maybe there is more of a lever to thinking life cycle cost when you don't have a
Mhm,
building owner but an institutional investor that holds, like buys to hold the property over a number of years to get returns from tenants renting it, right? Because that institutional investor can not only think for the next 4 or 5 years where it looks nice, but he also has to think about, the next renovation and the next update eventually for what the building that the building is ready to find tenants also in 7, in 10, 12 years. So that's one approach that could maybe be interesting, but that would bring you essentially directly into these multi-story, multi-family institutional projects. And then on the other hand, I mean, while yes, its quality is extremely important here for our product, for our customers, but even if it weren't, we would still build our panels to the utmost precision because there's simply no other way of doing it, right? I mean, if a piece of material is on a CNC, it
right.
is going to be accurate, whether I want it or not. It's not even going to cost you more. I mean, let's say I need to cut a stud. And I mean, whether you cut it with a motor saw, with your Swiss Army knife, or with a CNC machine, it doesn't matter. You still need to cut it. You need to cut it
Mhm.
once, right? We agree on that. And I believe if I have to cut it, I might as well do it accurately.
Right.
So essentially, what I'm saying is, I mean, of course, whatever product that comes out of any factory, it needs to address a specific segment and a specific market. But I am 100% convinced that there is no more efficient way of producing a building than doing it prefabricated and offsite, because I will never find better conditions to build a panel, to have my tools, my cranes, my screws and my nails ready, so I don't have to run
Mhm.
around the whole site to find them or drive home in the evening to get more materials, the ones that I broke or forgot the day before. So I believe no matter what level of quality you're building towards, still the factory and offsite is the most efficient way of doing it, and therefore also the cheapest one, especially in the long run. I mean, you're seeing it now. I mean, when the economy is booming, everyone is lacking skilled workers. The labor on site becomes more and more expensive. The quality levels are either dropping or at best staying the same. And I think that's what those this McKinsey paper showed us. Like, was it 5 7 years ago, where they said, well, look, construction industry, your productivity is lagging behind everyone else's. And we haven't
Mhm.
improved in decades, essentially. Well, everyone else, even agriculture, has had
Yeah.
some significant improvements over time.
Agriculture has had huge
Exactly.
improvements. It's staggering to see what agriculture is doing, and to think that we're still building the same way over and over, and we're so resistant to change. And that's something that will always boggle my mind, because ultimately, And it's funny because we're resistant to change in certain aspects where it's like, no one's going to use a handsaw to cut a 2x4 anymore. And, frankly, I don't even see corded skill saws on the job site anymore. Everyone's got a battery powered skill saw because it's easier,
Mm.
it's faster. I don't have to plug it in. Then you get the Festool track saw that's got a track built onto it. So now they get super square cuts. It's like, guys, you are using more innovative tools, but you're refusing to accept the fact that there's a bigger step you could take to making this process easier. And Kevin O'Connor from This Old House was on a couple episodes ago, and he talked about it. And it's like just the sheer amount of material that shows up to the job site in raw form and then is manhandled around the job site. Not once, not twice, but multiple times from getting off the truck to ending up in its final position. Where it's like I think about your factory, that material, these guys aren't lifting walls.
Absolutely
You
not.
you've built a facility that is handling the material, taking out the number one thing people don't want to do, and which is the hard manual labor that is just not. It's doesn't feel good. It's not good for you. It's not something that people are like, man, I can't wait to lift this wall up. It's like, no, you kind of have to buckle down and hope you don't hurt your back and get it up. And then after that, it's great. It's wonderful. Like, I'm super proud of this wall that I just stood up. But in the moment, it's like there's easier ways to do it.
Absolutely. And I mean, for me, like, I mean, I don't even know what to say anymore. I just simply don't understand why you wouldn't see that or acknowledge it. I mean, I have to quote Gary McConnelly from Entekra. I was recently on a panel with him in Canada, and I mean, I'm stealing this idea from him, so all the credit to you, Gary. So he had this beautiful picture of I think it was a Volkswagen, a German car, right?
Hmm.
And it was a picture where this car was essentially displaying all the single pieces that go into it, and they were kind of evenly spread out on the floor.
Hmm.
And Gary looked or showed this picture to the audience, and he said, "Well, guys, imagine you're going to your car dealer and you're buying whatever car, whether that is your Ford or Volkswagen or Ferrari for that matter. Imagine you've got two options. You've got option number one. You pay $100,000 for it, and it will be delivered to your front yard in one piece, ready to use. Other option, you still pay 100,000, but it is going to be brought to you in single pieces, spread all over your front lawn, and we'll send you five guys that will assemble it, over a course of a couple of weeks, and then it's ready to use." So why on God's earth would anyone think this is the right approach to being a building? It's essentially what we're doing when we're
Hmm.
not building off site, right? And
I
it's
love
just
that you made both of them 100,000 because that's where like anyone, a bunch of people are probably listening thinking, oh, he's going to say 50,000, 75,000. It's going to be cheaper. It's not.
no, it's not. It's absolutely, I mean, how would it be cheaper? How could it be cheaper if I mean, we're also using labor in our factory, but it's essentially the same labor that we would use on site. It's not that they're cheaper or more expensive because they get to work in a factory where they don't have to hurt their backs. It's the same people, same
Hmm.
salaries, same unions, for God's sakes. I mean, what am I going to do? Only thing that I have is, since the material is moving to the people, since they have conditions that they can work efficiently in, I can reduce the amount of hours I put in a panel inside the
Hmm.
factory versus what it would take outside. Now I'm buying the same materials, right? I need exactly the same bill of materials, whether I deliver it on site or to the factory, except most likely I need more material, therefore more cost if I do it on site, because I don't get to nest it on CNC machines. I have a lot more waste, I have a lot more faults, etc., deficiencies that I need to fix. So why would that car be more expensive? I think I'd love to talk to Gary about this. I mean, essentially, it would probably be 100,000 for the car that is basically built in your front yard versus 80,000 when it's delivered in one piece. That would probably be more accurate, and
Hmm.
then it's even more of a no-brainer, right?
But you know what? The argument that comes up is time. And it's like, well, we don't have the time to think all the like plan all this through. And so, we are building a what would be called a spec home here. We're always building custom, meaning we're always building homes for clients. We've always traditionally framed them, and we're building this spec home. So it'll be for sale, and I push really hard to make. I wanted to build the home completely offsite, and I was like, "We'll take the time. Like, let's work through this." And truthfully, it's been a challenge, and we haven't been able to make the cost work. And I sat down with the design team and we kind of chatted through a handful of things. And one of the reasons was we didn't design the home within the parameter of what made sense from a panel perspective. So what we were doing is we were requesting these oversized panels instead of working within kind of like a tolerance of what the particular manufacturer could build. Um, but now it's a matter of, well, now we don't have time. Like, now we're pressed against the clock, and we've exhausted that time, so we have to go to a traditional frame. But I'm doing it with this, immense pain in my chest, because I'm like, the whole point of this was to prove the experiment. Um, but I think that that's where the biggest struggle is, in especially when it comes to single family. There's no doubt in multifamily and in mid-rise and high-rise buildings, everything is built off-site. When I was working on that 28-story high, every piece of steel showed up ready to cut. All they did was assemble it, put bolted
Mhm.
everything together. That's how it would be. It would be insane to think that that steel would show up to the job site, and they would have to cut and manufacture each one of those beams and then put it up. That's what we're talking about. But we continue to do it in single family, and it's just, you know, I think about CLT as well. Like, we're going to be doing our first CLT project next year, or the end of this year, and we're early in the design process, and we had a meeting yesterday, and they're like, "Hey, we need to talk to the plumber, the HVAC guy, and the electrician," and we we don't have them on board yet, because frankly, we never need them on board at this time, because we can just call them when we're ready.
I totally get where you're at. I think what is important though, and also you can kind of break through it eventually, if I mean if one really wants to. I think we can break through, and I think one thing we have to understand here is that if we're building a home, whether that is a big project or a small project, if we're building a building, I think the amount or the number of decisions we have to take from day one to moving in is exactly the same whether this home is going to be prefabricated or whether it's going to be
Hmm.
built on site. Right? We have to decide, do I want a power plug? Do I want a light switch? Do I want a big window or a small window? And so on and so on.
Hmm.
But what we have to understand that is in offsite construction, we need to make more decisions at an earlier stage because we need to
Right.
know where that light switch is before we build the panel. Not because we couldn't fix it on site and still, change it around. We can do that. It's just simply not efficient. I'd rather just do it once and do it right. And I also believe that we need to help our clients or find ways to show our clients, hey, what does that mean? Like, I mean, it's so simple, right? In a bedroom, you want your two power outlets, right, and left side of your bed. It's just in every home it's the same now. Like, once we know which one is going to be the bedroom, we know a number of decisions that we need to get from the client, and we can even make good suggestions. Say, hey, we thought what you might want in that bedroom. You need your lamp, you need your two power plugs, you need this and that. We can even visualize it since we plan it in 3D. We have these 3D models you put on your VR goggles. You walk through the house, you see whether everything feels right, if it makes sense, if it's you see what you're actually expecting. Is there a flaw in maybe the process of how you move through your house, etc.? We can do that all virtually, and before we start wasting precious money on the wrong materials and on the wrong panels, etc. And I think
Right.
what you also have to think about there is, I mean, yeah, I get it in engineering, in basically making your project fit for a factory for prefabrication. Yeah, of course, there is thought that needs to go into the process very early on. But if you can do that in house with your own people and guide the external architect, guide your client towards solutions that work, um, it's essentially not going to be more work or more cost overall. And I like
No.
one more thing, please. I mean, I like that you're doing it in CLT, because in CLT you will have restrictions of how wide a panel can be, right? Your manufacturers will
Mhm,
tell you, hey, it's going to be, I don't know, 8 feet, and that's maximum. Deal with it.
mhm.
Now you still have to make it work, think about it, engineer it early on, because otherwise they simply won't be able to provide panels that are twice the width. So it's doable.
Yeah, I mean, so we started this particular project with CLT. That was our intent. And we designed the house, and they were like, the only way that this makes sense is if you leave all of the interior exposed because, it just, you're going to add a lot of cost. Like the cost savings, it only comes from not sheetrocking the
Hmm.
inside, essentially. But there was also, a number of pieces of steel and panels that just couldn't make the span. And so we kind of said, all right, we'll do it on the next one. Like we can't undo the design at this point where, you know, we own the property. The property costs us money for every day that we don't do something. Like we have to move the process. And then we looked at panelizing it. And just frankly ran into the same challenges where it's like we didn't design it with the intent of panelizing it with, this particular manufacturer. And we basically got to a crossroad where it was like either undo what we've done or keep moving forward. And I think that we'll continue to figure out how we can spend more time in the planning. And ultimately, if we end up traditionally framing it, I would think that we will do it in a way that is at least thoughtful and at least, thought all the way through, and we're not just building on consumption and just using materials in a inefficient manner, because then it's just completely pointless. So maybe we assemble one more Volkswagen in our driveway and it still costs us the same amount of money, and there's a little heartache there, but in effort to understand where the efficiencies really lie, even when we're doing all of the pre-thinking, the pre-planning, and you know allowing us to take the time in a future project on the front end, and realize that that was our hurdle. We
I
didn't.
think you said something extremely important, and I can't emphasize this enough. Um, I believe that 80 to 90% of the gains that come from prefabrication, from offsite, they're not coming from the factory. They're coming from thinking in that system and doing the engineering,
Mhm,
the planning beforehand. I mean, there's this nice cost curve basically at the beginning of a project where nothing is designed. With minimal cost impact, I can really steer or define the direction a project is going cost wise. So that engineering thing, and I would say I would even include architecture there. I mean, if you figure that out, everything that happens before the factory, there you will get, let's say 80% of all the gains come from there, from having a structured, well thought through process. And the nice thing there, or the good news is, if you get that under control and you have a team, an ecosystem that starts thinking in that way, at day X, when you have to decide on site or off site, well, it's not even going to make so much of a difference. You can still traditionally build it because the big
mhm.
change happens before anything happens on site or in a factory. So the good news is basically what I would advise in this case. I mean, start focusing your team on those issues in the planning, in the design and engineering process beforehand, and then
Mhm.
I wouldn't be as bold in this day and age where I'd say, yeah, build a big factory and then you solve all your problems, because the
I
factory,
really thought that was gonna be your
no,
recommendation.
it isn't,
Put 12
unfortunately.
times my revenue into it, build a factory.
No, I believe essentially, yeah, you or anyone else who's hearing, yeah, well, we need to take some risks and be bold with some things that we do, and if we really believe in the idea. Because yes, the factory also matters for
Mhm.
efficiency and for
Yeah.
process stability, and essentially also for the output that you will need for bigger projects. But a lot of the gains are happening way before that decision of on and off site is even made. And then that's the good
What a
news, right? You can start basically with within the traditional framework of what you're used
mhm.
to, but just start tweaking and thinking in those early stages of a project.
Yeah, what a great piece of advice, because I think that even myself included, like, we oftentimes think about what the solution is, and we're talking about panelization, offsite construction, but you're absolutely right that this starts with planning. Like, the only way you can efficiently build offsite is if you're really thorough with planning. So if you're really thorough with planning, whether you assemble the VW in the driveway or it comes fully assembled, if you're doing all of the same planning, you end up with the same product. Now, if that VW showed up and there was no plan and five random guys showed up and had a set of instructions in front of them, what would take them a week to assemble would now take them 4 weeks to
Exactly.
assemble. There's no
Exactly.
plan. We're not sure what these parts are. They don't, they, I don't have the right tools. And that's what I think I'm more comparing it to, where it's a lot of times our trades, and I say ours as in the US, like a lot of contractors, their trades are showing up and learning about the project for the first time. And I think about our projects now with, the one, our spec, for example. Even that one, though it will be traditionally framed, our HVAC guy, we basically verbally awarded him the job. We haven't even started the project. We're not even permitted. He's like, "Why am I involved so early?" It's like, "We want to just make sure we're planning for your ductwork." And he's like, "No, I'll figure it out on site." I'm like, "No, you won't."
Yeah.
Because the way we're designing this is there's not room for you to figure it out. Like, if you have a trunk line, let's make sure we plan for it. And not only that, we don't have the room or the aesthetic for it, but we also don't want you to have to. Like, why not? Let's involve you earlier, even if we pay a trade, right? Like, bring a HVAC guy on early, give him a retainer as like, hey, just help us work through this design. That way, when we frame it, we leave the space for your equipment, and you're not then trying to figure it out or modifying things in field. So I think, I appreciate that insight, because that is something that is really the product, the most important part of this, is that you are spending more time planning and thinking this through. And the more you can do, frankly, the more efficient you can be, but you can also be more, I'm going to use the word creative with finances. If you have all of this time built on the front end of figuring out how to build it, you're not going to be put in a position where you're reacting to construction. You're not in a position where you're reacting to, I need this material and this is the only option, where it's like, no, now you get to be proactive and think about, is this the best material to use for this case? Or should we look at something that's less expensive? Or should we reconsider doing this out of steel instead of LVL, and because we're thinking it through in
And
advance.
and I mean, think about it. How can you do an estimation if you don't even know really what is going to be in there? How many feet of cables and how many light
Mhm.
switches and whatnot do you even have? Like, you wouldn't know. So how
Yeah.
you don't have cost certainty, but you will be on site building as you go, paying bills as you go, and you'll end up, well, where you'll end up. Like, it's going to be really hard to control this, because your HVAC guy will say, well, I don't really know what I need to build. I'll build it, I'll do it efficiently to the best of my knowledge, but how am I supposed to know how long it will take, or how many feet of specific material or pipe or tube I need to put in? Now, in our projects, since we model anything, there is not even such a thing as estimation anymore. We call it calculation, because we know the bill of materials, you know, to the last detail. I know exactly what goes into my building. Therefore, I will only order what I need in the right dimensions, in the right quantities that I need, in the right qualities that I need. And that's how we also optimize cost. And I
Mhm.
strongly believe that, like, let's say an additional hour of that HVAC planner, or even if it's the builder that has a lot of experience. I mean, he might look at your plan and say, well, look, Nick, the way the amount of tubes that we need to connect from here to here is insane. Wouldn't it be just more efficient if we took the shortcut here?
Mhm.
And I mean, if you have the right experience, you will be able to engineer, basically design to cost something. You put in 2 hours of thought in it. Of course, you'll pay the guy, but you might
Mhm.
save tenfold in materials, in waste, in
Right.
building time afterwards.
That's those are the challenging conversations we have with clients and just anyone that's investing the money side of it, right? Where, we put together these proposals, and when we make these suggestions, it's, hey, let's bring on a consultant. Let's pay this consultant $5,000 to come in and engineer the HVAC. It's more often than not that they're like, "No, we don't wanna spend the 5,000 with the HVAC consultant. We'll just work with
I'd,
the
I'd rather
HVAC
I'd
guy and
rather
design
spend
build it."
50,000 more later on.
Exactly. It's like, well, what if that 5,000 invested saved you 50 grand on the design? Because maybe, and the reality is like, well, once it's designed and then it's priced, say it's, 5,000 invested and 45,000 for the equipment, then we don't always know that if we didn't use the consultant, it would have been 65,000 without him. So it's your this is where the trust comes in from, like, being experienced and being a good builder is like, hey, listen, like, by doing this, we know that we're not gonna over engineer the house. There's a good chance that if we don't hire the consultant, that maybe the HVAC contractor will know what equipment to put in and we end up with the right equipment, but there's nothing checking that,
Mhm.
and most people, especially engineers, are going to lean on the side of, like, making sure it's a little bit overbuilt, right? Where it's like, let's overbuild it to make sure that we've got our safety parameter. HVAC guys, they're going to be even more than that, or worse, they underbuild it. And then it's like, yeah, you saved a bunch of money, but your house is super
Mm,
uncomfortable. And you want to talk about not living in your home for a long time. A lot of people don't live in their home a long time because they're uncomfortable
yeah.
in them
You know,
subconsciously.
what helped us in that process to making that mind switch, I'd say. I mean, we started rather early on to act as a general contractor, of course, in a single family house space at the time,
Mhm.
but by us taking on the full responsibility for, you
Yeah.
as a customer get one house for one price, and that price is
Mhm.
guaranteed and defined early on when you sign the contract. I mean, it was our own responsibility to figure out the most efficient way of getting there. And then
Mhm.
we would be put in a position where we ourselves decide whether we want to spend, those X hundred or $1,000 on a consultant or on an expert or on a planner for a specific trade. That really helped us because then we didn't have to convince every single client at all times, but we could just convince ourselves. And once we were there, we would just kind of
Mhm.
fit it into the overall budget, and then it would be up to us of how we actually solved it. So that was, I think that was helpful for us, for our firm, to kind of get into that mindset, and yeah, just making sure that we could at least test those hypotheses, those assumptions, and oftentimes it turned out that it was really a big lever.
Yeah. What you said something, I went to write it down. You replaced the word cost estimate with what?
I mean, when you say here is the estimator, right?
Yeah.
And an estimation is not something that is clearly defined, right? You give a range
Mhm.
within 10% or something, or
Right.
I guesstimate it's about this much. We
Right.
calculate cost.
Calculate, yeah.
There's no
You
estimate or guesstimate, or we know the bill of materials. And I know behind every bill, every piece of material, I know my handling times, my CNC times, etc., etc. So I know exactly what that project is going to cost before I move my first finger in a factory, before I order the
and
first piece of material.
that is, I mean, So we don't operate that way. We are cost plus. There's just too many factors. Like it's, hey, you're paying us a fee on top of whatever it costs. And I don't you know, I don't like it for a number of reasons. You know, and I like it in the sense that it protects us now, but my goal is exactly what you said. It's like we should be able to get to a point when we're looking at, if when we can look at something and have all of the information and say it is going to cost this much money. This is what it's going to cost, and the things that oftentimes, you know, will scare us or put us in a position where it's like, well, it's we can't. There's things out of our control. Are things like building it on site. How long is it truly going to take these guys to fabricate it on site? How long is it true? Like, are we going to deal with weather delays? It's like, and by removing those uncertainties allows us to become more accurate. Where it's like if I became the builder in Boston that said, "Hey, I can guarantee my price." Like guaranteed, you sign a contract with us, guaranteed. No one, the majority of people are gonna be like, "You're crazy. You can't. You like it's construction." And that's the biggest. It's always the same excuse. It's like, how you can't guarantee it's construction. And they leave it at that. Like, the reason we can't guarantee pricing is because, quote, unquote, "it's construction." Well, why again, going back to,
Well,
you
why are
know
we the only industry besides maybe
exactly.
consultants that work that way? It just doesn't make any sense. And I mean, I understand where it's coming from because you simply, I mean, essentially, you don't know what it's going to cost you, but you create
Right.
your next problem right there. If you work on
Mhm.
cost plus fee, you don't necessarily have any benefit in reducing the cost to begin with, right?
Right.
Because you get your
Except for the
X.
client being upset.
Well, exactly. And as long as they're upset, but not upset enough that they will fire you, you're going to be okay. So you have a bit, in
Sure.
a certain way, misaligned goals there. You have a principal agent problem essentially. Now,
Exactly.
and then that obviously leads to, in general, in the industry, the client not trusting the builder, because why would
Mhm.
they? The builder makes more money in dollars, not by percentage is going to be the same, but in absolute
Mhm.
dollars, the more you spend on construction, the higher your fee will be. Now we need to align those interests, and essentially, I mean, what we're seeing here in Switzerland, we're at the point where we, not just our firm, but I mean the market as a whole, including all the investors, we're thinking of models. We say, okay, we've got a target price, a budget, basically. Now let's all work together as engineers, as planners in early stages to try to make this, to beat this budget that the investor or the owner has. Now, if we save, let's say, 10% from it, there is going to be a cost split. So the investor takes 7% and the planners get 3%, for example, or the builders get 3%. So we need to incentivize the system to think on behalf of the project and therefore essentially on behalf of the client. And as
Mhm.
long as we are misaligned there, the chances are super high that you will build with someone that doesn't share that philosophy and essentially can rip you off or doesn't take any risk essentially, um, because it's going to be cost plus fee, right? Simple. I mean,
Right.
we do that too, to be fair, right? We also have projects where we do cost plus fee. It's the
Mhm.
easiest thing to do essentially,
Sure.
right? You take zero
In terms
risk.
of protecting your margin, but, you know, yes. But from an administration standpoint, it's not the easiest way to operate.
Absolutely not. And I mean, we're getting at points. I mean, oftentimes in Switzerland we have these tenders, and you'd have a bill of materials or a bill of parts, and you put your prices in, right,
Mhm.
in that tender document. And then you sign that contract on basis of the total number. However, if your bill of materials change, the price is adjusted because you've got a piece of, or you've got a price point for every single item that goes into the building. Huge administrative work to calculate, all the square footage of this and meters of that and parts of this and so on. Huge amount of work that goes into it. Even when you plan everything perfectly, you still need to do that entire process. sent the client proof. It was essentially 7,535 screws of this size and this and that. Because it's not good enough that we drew it in the model, but no, we need to prove it was actually also built and used
Mhm.
on site. Now, what we do, because we know exactly what we're going to put in there, we might respond to the tender. Then we negotiate with the client and say, okay, we can give you another 2% off, but it's just going to be a lump sum. So we take out the administrative work. We
Mhm.
basically don't even have the risk in the first place because we know what we signed up for.
Right.
We go to the point,
Right.
I mean, think about this. These days, we have projects where the 3D model of the building, the digital twin, is sealed on the blockchain and it is part of the contract. The 3D model is part of the contract rather than a huge amount of printed plans that will always show most of it, but hardly ever all of it, every single
Mhm.
angle. No, but we just have a model. It's sealed.
Mhm.
No one can tamper with it anymore. Everyone knows what we signed up for. Everyone has the same understanding. You can visualize it, whatnot, and I mean you have incredible solutions there.
Ta Talk to me a little bit about that because that's where, like, I've been nerding out on this whole idea of having a digital twin of everything we build, and, you mentioned it being on the blockchain and sealed. What does that mean?
But what we essentially do is, I mean, we use all these different softwares to model our buildings, right? I mean, we need to work with
Mhm.
different clients, with different architects. Essentially, it doesn't really matter what software you use. What we
Mhm.
generate in the end is a so-called reference model that has all the information, everything that is essential to our contract. So let's say we're a general contractor, and the windows and the HVAC and the kitchens are also part of our contract. Well, those are going to be modeled to
Mhm.
exactly as they're going to be built. There's going to be defined factors like what type of material is used, what's the thickness of a cabinet door, what type of dishwasher is in there, etc., etc. And then we export this reference model as a IFC model, standard model that basically with every free model viewer you can open. And then we have a provider, it's a Swiss telecommunication firm here, that is able to seal this specific model and make sure that if anyone tried to tamper with it, like change any single value that is within that model, you'd basically get a red flag. So we have this sealed document where everyone agrees, and I mean, it's essentially proven that no one can tamper with it, otherwise we would know.
Mhm.
So we will always have this reference point. And if you change something as a client, like let's say all of a sudden, simple, you want two more windows. Well, no
Mhm.
problem. We will model the two more windows into the next evolutionary stage of that original reference model, and we will send you a request for a higher price or a quote for the higher price because we'll tell you, hey, look at the reference model, 7 windows, and now you've got
Mhm.
12. Obviously, that is going to cost something, and the amount of dollars is X. So you can still iterate with that model, or basically with,
Mhm.
I mean, not with the sealed copy, obviously, but that sealed copy is linked to exactly the contract stage where the cost and basically your work is exactly defined.
And and so that digital twin everyone has access to?
Everyone that needs
That,
to have
like,
access to it, it is an IFC, so it's basically well,
what's an IFC?
it's a type of format like a PDF. It's
Got it.
just a common
Got it.
model format. Like you'd probably see dot 3D is another one, but IFC is
Mhm.
kind of a universal um,
So
type
I
of
might have to
format.
download a 3D viewer, but I
Exactly.
essentially,
Don't need to.
yeah.
You don't need to have an ArchiCAD or a Revit or Rhino or
Mhm.
anything special to open it. You just download a free viewer. You can fly through that model. We can reference it, and then you know exactly what you signed up for.
And what so my wheels are spinning, but the model as all right, so you're the GC. Say you don't own everything. Say you don't have the HVAC in that. Is that model then going to the other trades? obviously the GC owns it, right? And they hire you. You're building the shell of the building, the windows, but they're going to handle the kitchens and the electrical and the plumbing and things like that. Are who's coordinating that?
Typically in Switzerland, the model let's not talk about models. Let's say the planning coordination is
Mhm.
part of the architect's job.
Is that so? I'm specifically pulling this back to like single family. So would that be the same in single
It
family?
could be. I mean, essentially, the architect in Switzerland is the one who oversees that everything fits
Mhm.
together, right? He
Mhm.
needs to make sure, well, if we need a hole for HVAC, there's going to be a hole in your floor plate,
Got
for
it.
example.
Yeah.
So we do the same thing. So it's ideally the architect that is coordinating the models. Um, when we're not the GC, that might as well be an external architect, but we help them early on. I mean, we basically, since um, our works I typically include the building envelope, the floor plates, the roof, and whatnot. We basically generate the shell of that model. Um, However, we need to know to produce the panels. We need to know, is there going to be a hole in it for HVAC, right? So we
Mhm.
have the HVAC planner in that case. We have them also generate the model instead of them just sending over plans or the architect drawing plans and getting quotes. We need to have this in 3D. I mean, if you want, if you have time, I can show you. Since you and I are on video right now, I'm not sure if that's going to work on Spotify, but if you're interested, I can show you for the ones who are watching it on YouTube eventually.
Yeah, yeah, let's see if we can pull it up. You should be able to. Can you hit present? Is
Yes,
there a
well,
present button?
I need to prepare it first, but I'll figure it
Okay,
out
great.
as we go. Um,
This is a great plug. If you guys don't watch these on YouTube, we do post them on YouTube. Which I always, you know what, I when we talked about that a long time ago, I was like, why would I ever watch a podcast on YouTube? And when Spotify started releasing the videos, I would sit there and I'd find myself watching everyone talk, and I'm like, it's way more engaging when you're watching people talk than listening. But I digress. Um,
Well,
I think
I hope this is a little incentive to maybe click on it on YouTube, so you'll see an actually rather up to date example of how this might look. I'm gonna narrate it as we go through, so also the listeners can basically have an understanding.
sure.
It is a bigger file, so I need to load it, but it's going to be there right away. And I think what's super important for us is, I mean, think about this. Even when we have clients, let's say we have an architect that is not ready yet, is not
Hmm.
doing all of these 3D models, even if we get a standard set of two-dimensional plans, drawings of a
Hmm.
building, floor plans, even then our team um, is building a model out of these two-dimensional drawings because for us it is a lot easier to get the cost calculation out of it if we have a model. So even if no one pays us for it, we go through the effort of building that 3D model with all the specifications that we need in order to get our cost calculation, our bill of materials out of that model. We're at the point where we, for example, the windows are so specifically um, detailed in there that out of the
Hmm.
model we can request a quote from a supplier, or we can
Hmm.
even order those type of windows. And we're not
Yeah.
talking about a standard size. We're only doing individual project. Every single project is essentially a prototype or a unique building. So
Hmm.
whatever the size, length, width, specifications of that window is, we'll be able to quote and order out of a model.
Yeah, I find that a lot with the European window manufacturers, and we're using a lot more of those in our projects where, we talk about, is there standard sizing? They're like, no, everything's built exactly to your order. That's just how we operate. So it's, if you're modifying something at a 16th of an inch, we'll modify it a 16th of an inch. There's no standard, or it's, you know, and I think that when you talk about modeling and going back all the way to, like, you're really thinking this thing all the way through, yeah, you can make those minor tweaks and ultimately have accurate enough information to be able to spit out a window order from that. Where, you think about how a lot of people building here, you're framing the building, you're getting a rough opening size, but then it's like, all right, well, which manufacturer are we going to use? It's like you might not even know at that point. It's like, well, you're creating all these rough openings and then hoping that the manufacturer has that rough opening size, or you're not building within their standard size, which is increasing costs for no reason.
Hmm.
Where it's like if you had thought that through and, say you were working with someone like Andersen, who's a sponsor to this podcast, but also a very common manufacturer to US Windows. Well, they might have a standard line of windows or standard sizing of windows that would help be more cost effective on a project. And the only thing you need to do is think about that before you design the opening.
Yeah,
And instead it's, that opening is loosely defined, and then it's built in this on site, and then you're ordering it and you're paying a premium for simply the the only reason you're paying that premium is because you didn't think it through, which goes back to our point about if you pay to think about it, or you're paying to bring someone on in retainer, or to help plan through a design, an HVAC design, a mechanical design. Just like you pay the architect and structural engineer, you pay these guys, and you can argue that small money up front can save you big money on the back end and throughout construction.
absolutely. And it once again brings me back to that point I made previously. I mean, essentially, you will need to decide exactly how big that window is going to be, right?
Mhm.
And we
Before
just,
you build it.
well, I'm saying in the process, you will have to make that decision
Yeah.
eventually. So why not
Mhm.
making
Alright.
that correct decision earlier, so you do maybe you are able to use a standardized part, for example, or something that is cost efficient or whatnot.
Mhm.
So I'm having a bit of trouble here to pull up those videos. I'm going to try one last shot. I think
Sure.
Google is limiting me a little bit of how much I can upload on here, and the file is rather big. But
Fair
and
enough.
if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I mean,
You
we'll
can
see it eventually, or it's probably on our YouTube somewhere, something very similar. Because essentially, that's what or this type of the way this works, we're using in all of our projects.
Yeah, if we're not able to pull it up, send us a link, we can add it to the show notes below so people can see it.
Yeah, you know what? Let's do that. I think it's easier and
Okay.
maybe also more fair to the ones just tuning in here. Um, Essentially, what it is, and I mean, I can still explain it. I mean, we plan everything into detail, but we also make sure that the model doesn't just look accurately from from what we would imagine as an architectural model, where we just see a nice building, but we make sure that the technical specifications are in that
Mhm.
model as well. So you would click on a specific panel, for example, an exterior wall, and it would then have tags with additional information of how exactly that wall is built. We, for example, color coded, so you could, let's say, display all exterior walls that are, let's say, position one of your quote. Let's say they're all yellow. You click on them, you see exactly what the position one in the quote, the X square foot of exterior wall resembles within the building,
Mhm.
what it is you're actually paying for, what is included in our contract, what is not included in our contract, because obviously the architectural model will always show everything. I mean, there's going to be an HVAC model in there, but obviously I don't want this to be necessarily part of my contract. So you color
Mhm.
code, you have all these layers you get to switch on and off to really get an understanding, and make sure everyone understands the model the same way. So this is directly linked then also to bill of materials that then internally on our side will link to our costs. So this is all matching together. And when someone, whether that is a client or a designer, changes something around, the whole thing basically happens automatically. We get a new quote. We essentially get. We're working on even getting a new timeline, for example, et cetera, et cetera,
Mhm.
just all automatically.
I mean, this is really interesting to me from the digital twin perspective, because this can tie into how we maintain the home later on. But I guess to ask you the question, when you think about single family homes, and I know where I keep pulling you back there, but what do you how do you sell the value of building this model for someone that's going to build a home?
Um, it really depends on the project and also what our role in it is. So let's say we're a
Hmm.
GC. So the whole design and engineering process is part of our job in the first place. So we don't need to convince anyone. We have strong beliefs that this is the right and most efficient way of doing it.
Hmm.
But we also have projects where we work with external architects, external engineers, and whatnot. And there, it really depends. On some projects, the client understands the proposition. They also see a value, for example, in operations later on, that they know exactly what has been brought into that specific building. So it could be um, part of the contract, right? Someone needs to model this, whether it might be the architect's job, it might be our job, and basically the least favorite part, but we would still do it even if no one pays us for it. For us, it's more efficient to calculate the costs of a specific
Hmm.
building through the model than having a bunch of plans and color coding them and measuring them and then calculating something or estimating something out of that. So even if no
Yeah.
one is paying for it, we have such efficiency gains internally that we will still build that model nonetheless.
It's funny, the reference to pricing and takeoffs is interesting because we were working through pricing on a project, and we had a design meeting with the architect, and we were talking about, oh, we're just working on the takeoff for siding or roof or something like that. They're like, oh, we have all that information in our model. Do you want it? And we were like, of course we want it. I mean, that's the whole like that if we have that information, we can we're now we're saving money in our estimating,
Mhm,
in our pre-construction phase of construction.
exactly.
And I think, I think from a builder's perspective, because a lot of guys that listen to this podcast are smaller contractors, or, whether they're tradespeople or own a small business or even renovation, they probably have a hard time relating like what you guys do to smaller residential work. And this camera's driving me crazy. Everyone on YouTube's gonna be like, "You're so blurry." Um, but they oftentimes have a hard time relating to this because we're talking about it at such scale. But the value add is so much more than that. Where, I've said it 100 times, and I'll say it 100 more. It's you're spending more time planning it, and you're being more thorough with it. Where ultimately having this digital twin, having the model of what you're going to build, gives you a true starting off point, and allows you to be more accurate, because if you're going to build the model, you're going to build it really accurately, and you're going to build these systems. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes, a lot of effort. Like in your case, you guys have enormous amount of investment into your process, where, the modeling is just a very small piece of what you guys do. Your factory is optimized in so many different ways. But if we can take everything that you do and relate it back to one thing, and how someone can improve their businesses, is take that time up front, and spend the time of truly understanding what you're building first.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise that's all you're doing is you're guesstimating at what something's going to be. You're jumping into a cost plus contract, which is, protecting you from a cost perspective. Like, hey, my contract states you got to pay me. It is what it is. But and you're absolutely right what you said earlier. It's like the reality is you'll probably be fine. They're probably not going to fire you. But the bigger issue is that they start not trusting the builder.
Mhm.
And I think I said this a couple weeks ago, is that when a client feels as though they're no longer in the driver's seat, it's a very bad relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's
And
difficult because we have to acknowledge that no matter whether you build for generations or just for the next 5 years, I mean, you take a huge amount of money and invested into a building. And you're obviously not a professional. You need to hire professional help, architects, builders, engineers, and whatnot. So there is kind of obvious it's kind of obvious that there will be some kind of trust issue, because you're spending all this money with people that you barely even know, and they lead the process because they are the experts.
Hmm.
So you kind of need to keep that client on board and build trust. And I also 100% believe in transparency. I mean, transparency is one key factor of building that trust. And being transparent also means I need to like prove or be able to show why my cost is what it is. And if I do have the model, if I have the bill of materials, I can really make it understandable for my counterparty. And I think being open about it and not having to hide that discussion of costs is extremely beneficial. And also, as I said before, since we do know what it costs beforehand, you can also you as a client always have the option to just pull out, right? I mean, we
Right.
do contracts with basically several gates that we need to go through. And I mean, obviously, I don't want to work for free. I mean, if we do a pre-construction phase, I don't want to do that for free. I have my people, productive people, putting all their knowledge into a project. And as you would pay an engineer, or as you would pay an architect early on, yeah, you also need to pay the team that is helping you design that building, to certain specifics, to certain budgets, to certain goals. So the client needs to understand, yes, it costs something, but it also gives me an opportunity that I don't necessarily then have to continue with this team. I mean, I spend 10 grand and I get an architectural project with a maybe at that time a cost estimation still. Then I engineer that. I get a cost calculation, a price guarantee. I see exactly what I'm getting, and I can still decide, hey, something is not matching here. I've lost trust. I can't afford it. It's not going to be financeable. Whatever the issue is, but you still have something. You have that developed project that belongs to you as a client because you paid for it.
Hmm.
So kind of navigating through those gates gives certainty, and I think it also builds trust on both sides, because I mean, we know that we're going to be paid for the work that we're doing, for all the input that we're getting, and
Hmm.
hopefully we'll maintain or build a relationship that lets us build the project in the end. But the client can at any gate basically say, hey, for whatever reason this is not working out. He gets to take the drawings, he gets to take the plans. He might as well go to the competition if he trusts the competition more, or if the competition is a bunch cheaper, for example.
The the thing there, I think that is important, or a good takeaway is that, you know, everyone talks about getting paid for pre-construction or pricing a project, but they're positioning it in the wrong sense of like, I'm pricing this so you then work with us. And kind of what you just alluded to is like, no, you're pricing it because you're bringing value to this phase of the project. And ultimately, if you work through it and they don't want to work with you, that's okay. You've been compensated for the input, and they get to take the output.
Exactly. And
And
I mean, to be 100% fair, I mean, yeah, of course, I want to make sure
of
we're
course, but it's
building,
your but
but
it's
it's
you, but,
my responsibility to be transparent enough, to
mm,
perform well enough, to convince the client that he best builds this project with us. And if I fail, or rather my team fails at this, well, fair enough. If the client
sure,
choose to go elsewhere, it's
right.
simple, right? You go to Walmart, you're looking for something, they don't have it, or they don't treat you well as a customer, off you go to Target or anywhere else, right? I mean, you're free to leave as long as you haven't been at the register and put your credit card in.
Right.
And that's kind of the same approach that we're going here. However, I mean, we also have to understand there is no such thing as free lunch. So we want people to pay for the value that we bring to a project. Like you'd go
Eh,
to an architect and you will pay for his services, whether you like what they draw or not.
right.
But you don't have to.
And
But you
that
don't have to pay him for, planning the whole project. I mean, do the first gate. Hey, have a draft of something, have an idea of something, spend 5K on it, and then decide whether
Mhm.
you like the person and you like his vision for your building, for example.
I like how you say that you have multiple gates where it's like, you know, we're not binding you into a contract, like, you're not required to go through this whole process. Let's prove ourselves at each gate.
Exactly.
And, you know, there's checkpoints along the way. You know, we want to understand, like, hey, you're coming to us, we believe we can provide the value you're looking for, and now it's our job to do that. But in order for us to do that, we need the resources, which would be money, so we can implement
Exactly.
time, input time.
And you
And
know what we do. I mean, we have to also understand this is not just empty words, but we have
mhm,
to walk the talk. Meaning,
mhm,
when we are hired as a timber construction engineer, like a civil engineer, but for a timber construction. It's clear mandate. We get a fee for that, X hours, and we have a list of deliverables.
mhm,
One of these deliverables can be that we engineer the project to a point where it's technically, um, anyone, basically any builder, is able to build it, right? We then oftentimes we create tender documents that we hand them to the client, so the client himself or his representative can go to the market and ask for quotes from different prefab timber factories. And the only um, limitation there, I want to be able to bid on it as well.
mhm.
That's the only limitation that I have. So if that is a given, well, we do that tender, we go to the market because we're not afraid of being challenged also on a price point of view. But I
Right.
at least
Because you're still confident in your process, and confident in
exactly, and
knowing what it's gonna cost to build.
exactly, and I have to be honest here. That doesn't mean we're winning every single one of those. It can be, for example, let's say one of our neighbors, for example, who does a similar thing. Well, they just don't have that much work in August, and our project
Mhm,
just comes into August, and someone is willing to just basically do anything to get the work in their factory. Well,
mhm,
of course, these people look at cost differently. They
mhm,
look more at, well, the fixed cost. We need to cover those as much as possible, and that's about it. On the variables, we can be more flexible. Well, then we might lose that, but that is fine because the client paid us fairly to the point where we're at. We delivered
mhm.
something that that client was able to use to get the best possible solution for his or her project.
Right,
Fair enough. Name of the game.
right. And to relate that back to, what I do and what a lot of people do is, you go through pre-construction, you're the whole point in that, and I think this is where the biggest mindset shift needs to happen, is that you the point of that is not to get them to build with you. The point of that is to work through the process and bring that project to a buildable state.
Exactly.
Understand what it's gonna cost, understand how long it's gonna take, and understand the constructability of it,
Exactly.
and outline those 3 things. And during that process, if you're nurturing the relationship correctly, there's a good chance that you're in the front row of,
Exactly.
like, who they're gonna build with.
Exactly.
But ultimately, my general conditions for running a project are much higher than a guy that might have a three-man operation. But if they take all of the work that we've done, that we've also been paid for, and then say, "Hey, Nick, I appreciate it, but I'm actually going to hire John over here," and John's got 3 guys, and he's a smaller, guy with a truck. All right, you know, at least I know I just set John up. John's good. He's got everything he needs. He's going to do it less expensive than I am. It's probably a different deliverable, but they didn't value our deliver they didn't value our management model enough to have a dedicated super or a dedicated PM. They felt as though that, no, they wanted to they wanted to understand how this was going to be built, what it was going to cost, and how much time it's going to take, but they're going to work with this guy over here. And that's totally, and I think that that's the part that we need to be okay with, is that not only are we getting paid for what we're doing, but our focus is more refined during that process, and we're helping the industry do a better job. Because otherwise, if we're gonna compete at that phase, well, John over here might not have the resources to do a good job in estimating the project. Where then they go through the traditional bid model and they have me bid it, and I'm whatever $2 million, but John over here is $1.5 million, and now it's like, well, I don't really understand apples to apples, but I'm just gonna hire John because he's $500,000 cheaper. And it's like, and next thing you know, it's like he ends up at 2.1 because he missed stuff, or he didn't factor in certain things because he didn't get paid for that process, and or he didn't have the resources in order to do a really accurate cost estimation. And instead, it was just this kind of wild ass guess, and they got the job on that, based on that. And then this is the common story you hear. It's like every job is over budget. It's like we're not doing the work appropriately before construction. We are rushing that process to get to a number that oftentimes means nothing. It's
Exactly. And
who can tell me the best number
and I mean,
in the
let's be
in the
honest.
most confident way.
Yeah, in the most confident way, and I mean a number that the client will like well enough, so they will
Right,
actually start building or
right.
producing something. I think what's also important, and you also mentioned it before. I mean, construction oftentimes feels like very reactive. Like you are on
Mhm,
site and you need to make that decision today because the other guy told you those windows have a lead time of X, and you need them, and you don't have time to shop around, to compare, to find other options. Now, if we make decisions early enough in plan a project appropriately, that also means we've got enough lead times to compare different window manufacturers, to get quotes from for different, I don't know, bathroom sinks, for everything, basically for the critical parts. We are able to find the best possible solution, also have the market compete. And yeah, I mean, of course, that is extra work, right? If I need three quotes, it's more work than when I only need one quote. In a cost plus fee, why would I care as a builder? I try to make my life as easy as possible. First guy that I somewhat trust and gives me a somewhat accurate number that somewhat fits into the overall budget. Well, okay, I'll hire that guy, or I'll order my windows from there. Now, when we take more responsibility and guarantee a price, we are keen on finding the best possible solution at the respective quality that was stated in the contract. Like, I mean, we don't reduce quality in this process, but if we have several manufacturers or something, or several suppliers, wholesalers of something, well, I get
mhm,
to negotiate with them. And not in the last moment where I basically only have one option left, but early enough so I can actually get some gains out of that. And that
mhm,
also means I need to go through that process because my original margin might not be what your fee on top of the cost would be. I need to
mhm,
kind of win that margin by actually doing a good job. So in the very beginning, I might only have a few percent, but then by doing the job right, having a team that really fights for getting the best possible solutions for the project, well, then I can increase my margin in the process, but I need to do a good job in order to do so. If I screw up, if my team screws up, or we hit a bad spot in the market, for example, well, that is also our risk that then we have to take, obviously.
yeah. This conversation went in a different direction.
But but but
Um,
but I think
but an important one.
it is certainly insightful. I think in certain regards. However, we have to take into consideration also different markets, and different markets work differently,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
it's maybe some of it might be relatable. I think my message here is plan projects early, do it right, and
Mhm,
this pre-construction phase, this engineering and planning is where the gains lay way before investing in a big factory and automation and CNC. So
mhm,
that's kind of the one takeaway. One thing I'd like to mention though, and it's really important for me. I mean, we've talked a bunch about numbers and machines and quality, but what is essential to get there is you need the right people, you need the right culture
Sure.
within your firm. And I can't emphasize this enough that we as entrepreneurs also need to make sure that we have a great team that takes responsibility, that fights for the client, fights for the project, essentially to get good results. And I think that's something that is often forgotten, especially in this construction industry where a lot of it is very hands-on and rushed, and it is the way it is because it's always been that way. We need to make sure we create an environment, a work environment where construction jobs are fun, are somehow rewarding for the team that works for us, and in general become more attractive as an industry. Because if we don't, well, we'll not only look at not being able to manufacture or build anything on site, but we simply won't be building at all. I mean, because we won't have
Mhm.
the people, because everyone is working for more attractive industries. And I think there is a lot to be gained if we have committed people that really believe in the cause of building essentially, I mean, also building a more sustainable future. I mean, we have to see how much CO2 for how much CO2 the building industry is responsible, with all the waste, with all the construction that goes, with all the malfunctions and deficiencies that happen because it is construction, because we just accept that fact. And I think we really do have a responsibility there, to be part of the solution, not stay part of the problem.
I mean, the culture is something that I think we hear a lot. And when you talk about the right people, like for you, and this is actually where what I was alluding to in the beginning, when you think about the culture and think about innovation, and how those people are involved in that, I had said earlier, everyone in that factory was super happy, but I also noticed that everyone, like, they seem to have a pretty healthy respect for work and their own personal life. And that was evident just in the country in general. And so when you think about, I guess, like, my final thought, or your final thought on, like, when you think about the people compared to innovation, and you think about what the future of construction truly holds in terms of, you know, robots and CNCs and computers and all of this, how do you see that relationship between man and machine evolving?
I think it will evolve. I think the industry has never been in any state where industrialization and robotization has been um, more likely to happen than now.
Mhm,
However, we haven't yet seen machines that really deliver on the promise on just fully automated production of
mhm,
panels. I've seen a bunch of machinery that can do a lot. However, we always had manual interference in the process. That also
mhm,
means my manual labor essentially needs to be in the factory on the floor at any given time because there's so many interactions they need to do. And as long as I have my people in the factory waiting for their next move, I might as well have them working the entire time.
mhm.
So I believe as of right now, we're not quite there yet. I do also believe that in the future we will see more robots in those factories, certainly. But I also don't think that leads to us not needing the workers that we have today. I just think we need to re-educate them to deliver even more value, to be able to, for example, program these machines, or to make sure the quality control is immaculate, or to take all their experience of how to best build a panel, of how to best assemble panels on site. That will then be the deciding factor, because I mean our robot is going to be as fast as the next guy's robot. It's not
Right.
the machines that make the difference, it's the people and the processes. And as of right now, I mean I'm super impressed with what for example ChatGPT can do. However, I saw this nice sign. I think it was on LinkedIn of one guy that I follow. It was a building, and there was a sign up there,
Yes.
"Hey, ChatGPT, please finish this construction site" or something.
It's a great it's so funny you mentioned that. It was stewing in the back of my head and I was gonna mention it. It's great. It's a great perspective on how important, human is to the building industry.
Absolutely. And I think it will stay extremely relevant also in the next decade or two. More
Sure.
than that, I don't like to make prognoses because I mean we all know where that leads. But I
Sure.
think essentially the way we look at it right now, I mean I have the utmost respect for the people that we have, and we were just thinking of ways of how we can even use them in more interesting ways, how we can grow them and their skill set
Mhm.
in the same speed as the industry as a whole is kind of moving. And one final thought, because you mentioned it twice already. I mean, these the happy people in the factory, right? I don't necessarily think it was just happiness that you saw there, but I think way more you saw people being proud of what they're doing, and
Yeah, that's a
that
great point.
taking pride in the work that you do is such a strong driver for quality, for efficiency, for essentially a great customer experience and a great product, that I just believe that makes such a big difference. And I mean, when you visited, I mean, these people were proud that they got to show off their skills. They were proud
Yeah.
that they're recognized, and people are interested in what they're doing. And I think this is the things that we really need to focus on, and where we really can make a difference as a company, compared to the industry as a whole.
That's a great point. Yeah, I would say that all those guys were, I said happy, but I think you're right. I think it was pride in their work and just excited to kind of show what they were doing. Even when we were filming, it's like they would go out of their way to make sure we got to see the cool little details.
Exactly.
So,
So
well,
yeah.
David, I appreciate you being on, man. I'm glad to reconnect. Super excited for you, and I think you said October is when you officially take over.
Exactly. September, October, we're having the anniversaries, the festivities, and then also the handing over the reins to the next generation. Um,
It's amazing.
so yeah, we're super proud that we get to be part of it, and also um, I'd say humbled that we have this opportunity and get to share it with a great team, great management that helps us carry on and being continue being innovative and being on the forefront of the industry. So
Well, you guys have an amazing operation. I appreciate you being on. I appreciate you allowing me to tour the factory when I was out there. And we'll get your video of the coordination linked in the description below, as well as your website and things. And until I'm in Switzerland again, we'll chat.
thank you so much for having me, Nick. It was great being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.